The Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Classics World on Your Marques, the chance to discuss the highs and lows of a popular car make. Joining me today, as last time, is the motoring journalist Jack Grover. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Phil. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you. Yes, good. We've discussed Jaguar in a previous episode, and I wanted to veer off from a British make and talk about a different marque today, namely Honda.
Excellent, interesting choice.
Oh, well, I think so. Yeah, because I think it's a fabulous Japanese car make that's got such a sort of wonderful back catalogue of models and these sort of intrinsic links with the UK as well, which I think make it a really fascinating car company to discuss, I think, at length. So my first question to you, Jack, is what's the first thing you think of when you mention the word Honda?
The first thing that came to my mind there was engines. That's what I always associate Honda with, and more broadly, really good quality design and engineering, even in really bland cars.
I think I utterly agree with that. I think I wrote down a few sort of buzzwords when I sort of wrote down Honda, and design and engineering excellence was the main sort of mantra that I came up with. And when I talk about design, I don't even necessarily mean styling. I just mean good design, and that boils down to the sort of the way that an engine is built or the way the interior is constructed or something. It's not just the way a car looks necessarily, but I just think, yeah, design and engineering excellence is the thing. Bizarrely, I think of Honda as for bikes as well. I don't know anything about bikes. It's worth just stating for the record. But I believe that they're just synonymous with bikes. Huge success in America was another attribute I put to Honda, particularly with their Acura brand.
Yes, the first to do it, the first to do that luxury in America brand thing of the Japanese makes.
So they precede Lexus, do they?
They do, yes, by a couple of years.
Motorsport was another thing I thought of with Honda. I can think of very strong associations with Honda in Formula One back to the McLaren days in the 80s. And the sort of slightly ill-fated noughties period when Jenson Button was driving for them. And of course, recently their involvement with the Red Bull team, which has already started to yield success. And just at the point they're coming good, after all their hard work, they've obviously announced they're pulling out, which is rather a tragedy in my opinion. But of course, they've also been very successful in things like British touring cars and things like that. So that's, I think, a testimony to their engineering prowess that we've just spoken about. And of course, linked to that is reliability.
Yes, of course.
Their engineering excellence means that even if they have got an engine that's capable of revving to 9,000 RPM, their cars are almost always usually reliable. Providing they're well maintained and all that kind of stuff. I
absolutely agree. I think that's the heart of why, even though I've got absolutely no personal experience with Honda, really, I've never owned one. No one in my family owned one. I've never had any sort of lived experience with them. I've driven quite a few in the job over the years, but not for anything long term. And yet I always feel I've got very, very positive feelings towards Honda. And there's a danger this podcast might turn into some sort of unpaid advertorial, because I get quite evangelical about not so much the cars, although there are plenty that I will do, but the way that Honda do things as a company and the way they've got a sort of ethos. I generally always like companies that have an ethos and then don't just look about making cars to just put dollar positive bits on their balance sheet. I like companies that make cars with a purpose, and I think that's the defining feature of Honda, that it's the only Japanese company that's named after a person, or the only Japanese car company that's named after a person. I think that vision runs through the company's products, and I think that's what gives them character, which is a very rare thing. Basically, they're the only Japanese car they're one of two Japanese car makers that I, in my experience, have character, and therefore you get the benefits of a Japanese car in the terms of the reliability and the build quality and the design integrity, but then you also get character, which is usually associated with the more exotic non-Japanese brands. So, and if anyone from Honda wants to pay me to say these things about their cars, get in touch.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The address to deliver my NSX is the following. I totally agree. There's something, I don't know whether this is considered to be slightly cliche, but there's something that I think that's very typically Japanese about Honda, and I mean that in all the best possible attributes. I think there's an integrity and a depth, and yet it's not shouty. Do you know what I mean? They're not.
I do.
Even the boldest cars that they have done in the past aren't shouty, and when they do shout, they do it from a place of substance.
Yes.
You know, proper engines, proper design. They haven't cut corners. It's not a rebadged, reclothed, fairly sort of cheap car. It's been done from the ground up, usually with absolute thought and attention to detail at its very core, and I think that's what's always seen Honda through in my eyes.
I think you're right, and they get the engineering integrity first, and then if they are shouty about it, that comes on top. Like, you know, if you take a mid 90s, what would that be, Gen Mark V Honda Civic, that is not a exciting looking car or even particularly interesting looking car. It sort of blends into any supermarket car park of the time, and yet you don't even have to go for a Type R. Get a VTI, which was making, packing 160 horsepower from a 1.6 litre engine, which I believe was more power per litre than the NSX of the time made. And yet you would not know that from looking at it. And it's perfectly reliable, and it's got 12,000 mile service intervals, and in the UK at least, most of them were bought by people aged over 50 to toddle to the bowling green and back. So it's the thing that keeps coming back to with Honda, is that they seem to manage to square all the circles that Fox in other car companies, where they manage to make cars that are fantastically highly strung and packing huge amounts of power from tiny engines and really precisely made and high tech and complicated, and yet they also top all the reliability charts all the time, and you can use them every day as a car to go to the shops. And you wonder, why doesn't every car company do this? And then you read Honda's history and you realise why.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So what are the standout models for you then, Jack? What are the sort of the iconic models, would you say? I'm
going to sound like such an old fuddy-duddy here. I get a real kick from the fact that the bland Hondas are yet also the ones that do all the stuff I just talked about the best. I love the fact that the Civic and the Accord are, on the front of it, really boring. Some of the blandest interior, most sort of humble, lowest common denominator shopping trolleys and family saloons ever made, and yet they're just really, really good cars. And every now and then Honda will throw out a Type R or a VTI or something that will just mess with the formula a little bit, and it'll become a really, really good enthusiast's car, and without getting to all sort of the tuning side of things. That is what Honda is to me. Honda is always the bland car done really, really, really well, to an extent that you think, this really, why with your logical, emotionless brain overruling your heart, why would you have anything else? So for me, it's the big hitters. It's the Honda, it's the Civic, it's the Accord, things like that are the standout ones to me.
It's really interesting you say that. It's really interesting you say that about the bland cars, because I remember a few years ago going car shopping with my mother-in-law, who was replacing a clapped-out Fiat Punto, when basically this 12-year-old Fiat Punto was basically worthless scrap metal. Like, it had literally crumbled to an MOT catastrophe. It was worth nothing. I can say lots of bad things about Fiat because Joe's on mute. But anyway, so we went shopping for a new car for her. She had about £5,000 to spend. And the two cars that I took her to see were a Honda Jazz Mark I and a Seat Ibiza. Now, this Honda Jazz was remarkable. It was absolutely remarkable. It was pristine condition. It looked like it could just have rolled off the factory line. It was so good condition. I can't even remember how old it was. Maybe just 3 or 4 years old. I loved it. I loved the way it drove. I loved all the practicality with it. It had this slightly odd sit-up styling. But I loved the fact that the back seats could move backward and forward, so you could have a bit more legroom if you wanted the legroom, or if you needed a bit more boot space, you could sort of slide it forward and all that kind of stuff. I loved the sort of ergonomics of the cabin. It was almost sort of Isagonis in its sort of thinking about cabin design and all that kind of stuff.
No, that original Jazz is a really good car, but again, a really good example of where Honda have gone, we're not just going to make a Super Mini or a small hatch, whatever class the Jazz, that's the whole point, it sort of straddles the two, but they actually sort of thought about it from the inside out. And as you say, it's again, you could say it's that Isagonis approach of designing the car from the inside out first, and then just thinking about how people are going to use it and coming up with a really nice car.
And the tragedy is she chose the Ibiza, which I don't really understand. Because she said, in quotes, "I'd feel like a bit of a grandma driving this." Now, I didn't really have the courage to tell her that, well, you are a grandma and actually that's okay. But I think she just sort of liked the idea of having a slightly cooler, maybe VW-based car. Her daughter lives in Spain, so maybe there was a Spanish connection with the Seat brand, I don't know. But it was all rather tenuous. I think the Jazz would have been the better car. My mother now owns a Jazz. And, I mean, it will just last forever, this thing. I mean, she only does about 6 miles a year, so I don't know why she bothers with a car at all. But the Honda Jazz for her is the car that can nip to the shops and, nip to us 2 hours away quite easily. Standout models then, you reckon the Civic and the Accord and all that kind of stuff?
I think so. I think because they're the ones that Honda's greatness is made of. It's the same I think it's the story of Honda as a company that fascinates me the most. I'm amazed there hasn't been a film out. There's probably been some sort of 65-episode anime series made about it in Japan, detailing the life of Soichiro Honda. But it was founded in 1949, which is really, really late as car companies go. And I think until the recent generation of electric startup companies like Tesla and Bollinger and things came up, it was the youngest car company in the world that wasn't one that had been set up to make licensed cars in the global south. So in 1949, when the rest of the industry had basically matured, and then Mr. Honda decides to start making bikes, and then within 10 years it's the world's biggest motorcycle maker, and then in 12 years, I think it's won all 3 CC categories at the Motorcycle World Grand Prix Championship and things like that. And then within 30 years, it's made the Civic and the Accord, and I think has either become the best-selling car in America or is well on its way to doing so. And it's that incredible meteoric rise of doing stuff of starting from the bottom and doing very, very plain Jane, humble stuff, but with that Honda twist, and that's what I find so fascinating about them. Personal experiences, I say, I don't really have any, but I do remember one of the Hondas that you've owned, which was that Civic Marque 6 that you picked up for a £5, and it had some interstellar mileage on it that lurked around in the company office for a bit.
Yes, that's right, yep.
And that car looked like it had been sat outside for 20 years and 250,000 miles, but did not drive or feel like it. I didn't know what happened to that car. Did that car finally expire, or did it go off to some... I
think it did have to go to the automotive pearly gates in the sky, yes, because I think it
for some small sensor or something, wasn't it?
Well, I think we used it for like a tyre change challenge for our motoring events. So we bought it for buttons, like 150 quid or something, and it had ridiculous mileage. But actually, it was still roadworthy. So people were driving this back and forth to Silverstone and the likes, sort of laden with jacks and wheel guns and all that kind of stuff. Like you say, you would never know it had something like 200,000 miles on the clock or something. It just kept on going. It was phenomenal. I do understand what you're saying about the sort of humdrum models, because you're right, it's the very foundations of the brand. I mean, for me, the Halo models that have really lifted it to a prominence amongst petrol heads, as well as kind of day-to-day kind of car buyers around the world. So I would say the Honda S2000 as a standout car.
Shouldn't we declare an interest here, Phil?
Yes, I need to come forward and confess that obviously I own one and have done for since 2012, and absolutely love it. There's been brief moments where I've flirted with selling it, and then I get to that kind of awful moment. I think no, I can't sell it. I don't think I ever would. I mean, I even remember searching for the car back in 2012 and toying whether to buy a Bmw Z3 or an Audi TT Roadster or what was the other one, a Porsche Boxster, for example. And for me, the S2000 was the least obvious and therefore the most attractive choice. Yeah. Like, I loved the fact that it was the least trodden path. And of course, as it turned out, for the $5,000 or whatever it is I paid for it at the time, it was, I think, infinitely the best value proposition as well, because, you know, touch wood, nothing has gone wrong with it. You know, it's always been annoying little things like a central locking solenoid or the bonnet catch has seized through lack of use. Like, I mean, if you wanted an example of how reliable it is, the bonnet catch stopped working because I didn't have to lift the bonnet very often. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. You know, it just didn't need attention at all. But apart from the Honda S2000, which of course is the best Honda they've ever made, and not at all biased in that opinion, I do love things like the NSX. I just think it's such a kind of statement of intent. I mean, I have no idea what the commercial success or otherwise of that car was for Honda, but I just think it's a wonderful Ferrari bashing car without any of the kind of glitz and glamour of the cars that it was aiming to take on. And you sort of think it was up against things like Lotus Esprits and things like that. You know, I know it's not as cool as a Lotus Esprit or as exotic as a Ferrari 348, but having now driven one, I just think, what a phenomenal piece of kit. I drove the facelifted 3.2 model as opposed to the original one, but just what a fabulous car. I thought it was absolutely superb. But besides the sporty stuff, I was going to say I actually quite like things like the Insight.
I love the Insight. No, the Insight, I absolutely love particularly the Mark 1 Insight is one of my all-time wishlist cars. I love those. I fortunately have never been able to experience one, but I love, again, that's that Honda sort of design corporate philosophy running from something into a completely new area for them, you know, making two-seater hyper-economical hybrid cars, and yet you can see the sort of the family not resemblance, but the family DNA from the Insight to the Civic to the NSX, and they've all got that Honda-ness about them, where we're going to make a supercar. It's going to be really reliable and really well made and be really efficiently engineered, and it's going to be really practical and durable, and yet it'll also be as good as a Ferrari in the performance stuff. And then we're now going to make a two-seater car that's going to be the most economical car in the world with a groundbreaking electric assistant hybrid system, and then it is, and it's also really clever and very well engineered and lasts forever and things like. And that's why I like Honda. I like companies that do things with a purpose rather than just saying we need to make a new B segment hatchback because the other one's 5 years old. Here's one that's good enough, and Honda don't do that, and that's why I admire them.
I've got another left field choice for you as well. The FRV.
Oh, the FRV now. Which one's is that? That boxy little MPV
six-seater one. Yeah,
it's the sort of like Honda Fiat Multipla, isn't it?
Like you sort of think exactly that. You sort of think everyone was doing MPVs and all that kind of stuff, and actually there's several MPVs that Honda did. Wasn't there one called the Honda Stream or something? The most ridiculous name ever.
You're probably getting into some sort of weird American market only or Japanese market only ones that I don't know about.
Well, the Stream did come to the UK, I think, but it was, you know, such in modest numbers. I mean, that was quite a big, bulky, people carrier. Now
that I've actually Googled it, I do know what you're talking about. But again, in the very Honda way, you could swap the badge on that and it would be almost anything, and it would just completely disappear in traffic. And I'm not surprised I don't remember it, but.
I can't imagine it sold in massive numbers. It would have been gazumped by the Renault Espace and things like that, I would imagine, and the Toyota Previa maybe. But the Honda FRV is, again, another, I think, example of fresh thinking from Honda. It takes up a footprint on the road that would have been smaller than the equivalent of Espace or, Toyota Previa. And yet this was a car with ingenious foldy seats that meant you could still carry 6 people. And if you think there's probably a load of families that needed a daily runaround that might have had mum, dad, and 3 children, where a kind of regular-sized Honda Civic wouldn't have quite been practical enough. And yet there we are. There's an FRV doing what you want. And if you're kind of a medium-sized family around town, then that would have been the car to have. An ingenious car. There's not many of them around, but the ones I've seen for sale have got astronomical mileage on them, 200,000 miles. They clearly still all go. Some of them have clearly been a bit battered where they've been sort of well used. But I just think that's another really kind of interesting Q car for them. But bizarrely, again, another car that for me sits under the radar and yet is actually better than many of its competitors is the CRV.
Yes.
4x4.
So the CRV is one of the few Hondas that I do have some experience of because... I suppose he technically is my stepfather. I don't like calling him that because it sounds like something from a sort of a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. But yeah, my stepfather has one, and he has one of the original first gen, quite an early first gen CRV, and so that is now pushing over 20 years old, I think, or must be coming up for it, and he used that, and then very recently got dispatched down to Devon to go and live with my sister as their dog and baby and Devon off-road tracks that are actually technically roads but don't look like them car. And again, that has it's starting to have the general wear and tear of a 20-year-old car, and that the suspension is, each MOT, another different corner of the suspension needs rebuilding, and it's got a few electrical glitches. Like I think if you lock it from the wrong door, the whole central locking goes into sort of deadlock mode, and you have to sort of break a window to get into it and things like that again. But structurally and mechanically, it just rolls on, and I dread to think how much abuse that car has had over its years. It's not had an easy life, and yet it goes on, and it's a really well designed, practical SUV in that one of those, that very early, what would now be a crossover, it was then the sort of on-road, off-roader SUV class.
And those Mark 1s are kind of odd because they've got that column gear change thing, I think, going on, rather than down in the transmission tunnel. Well, certainly the ones I've seen. I know that the chairman of Kelsey's got a 2005 one, and it's got the auto shift up in the sort of steering column.
Maybe the auto ones, I don't remember. I think this one's got a normal gear shift. I think it might be mounted sort of on the lower dash, a bit like the Jazz and the 7th gen Civic have got that, I think. But it has one ergonomic goof from Honda, which is surprising because they're usually very good about that, is the handbrake is sort of integrated into what would be a grab handle on the driver's side of the dashboard, and it has always needed two hands to use properly just because it's in a stupid place, and I suspect Honda were doing that so they could fit a flat floor.
So the CR-V for me is probably, I don't think I'd ever have an SUV because I always sort of begrudge the fact that they're heavier and bulkier than a hatchback, and yet actually offer no better interior packaging than a regular hatchback. So you're buying something that's more expensive, heavier and everything else, and goes around corners less well. But anyway, if I was to buy an SUV, the CR-V would be probably the one to go for, because it's bigger and better than, say, the best-selling Qashqai. Roughly the same sort of money, particularly on a second-hand market. Capable of four-wheel drive and hauling families and all their luggage around, and yet it's probably the lesser well-known one. People would opt for a Qashqai or an X-Trail or even a RAV4 or something like that over the CR-V. And I think it's just a fantastic piece of kit, and they've got bigger and bulkier, obviously, as time goes on. The current generation one is a behemoth, but I'd rather have one of those than a Freelander or a Discovery Sport, put it that way.
No, I think you're right. And yet again, we're coming with all these very good reasons why all these Hondas across numerous different market segments are actually really good, and yet they sort of, none of them are flying high in the marketplace and haven't done for a while, certainly not in the UK and Europe at least.
No.
And I think this is coming back to the heart of the issue, which is Honda have never had any kind of, I was going to say snob appeal, but even that's sort of oversimplifying it a bit. They've never had any nothing to appeal to your heart, not your head, unless it's a Type R or another sporty one, which then tend to appeal to people who don't really buy cars new. And
yeah, well, I guess, what about the Type R thing? Because there's the Integra Type R, the Civic and Accord had Type R models as well. But again, they didn't really gain the same traction that, say, a BMW M car did or anything like that, and yet they are phenomenal.
And I'm sure it's because they don't have the image to go with it. Because part of the thing about buying a Honda M5, BMW M5, is that not only is it a really good sports saloon, but it's also got the BMW, particularly in the 80s and 90s, the BMW sort of yuppie premium German engineering badge appeal, and the fact that it's a aspirational car because it costs a lot. And although a Civic Type R was the most expensive Honda Civic, it wasn't that expensive, and it was bright yellow, and it had loads of spoilers all over it, and it still had a Honda Civic dashboard made out of smooth grey plastic. And
well, there's an interesting idea. So a lot of manufacturers bring out halo cars because they obviously glow down on the rest of the range. Actually, what you're suggesting there is that Honda's got these sort of dull but worthy base cars that have dragged down the halo cars almost. So that's almost the reverse effect.
Essentially, yes. And even the Honda S2000 and NSX, which I've been lucky enough to drive your S2000, and it's an amazing car. It's one of probably the best driving experiences I've ever had in a car. As good as they are, the fact that it is just a Honda, even though we can sit here and explain in detail why that's no bad thing and it's actually a really good thing, they just don't get the sort of aspirational, emotional appeal that a lot of, dare I say it, less worthy car manufacturers do.
And why haven't they survived? Is it because things like the Type R models ultimately end up getting modified, ragged, bagged, crashed, bashed, whatever, and they don't last?
That would be my impression, because in anticipation of you asking me towards the end of this recording, given us X amount of money, what Hondas would I buy? I've been looking at these, and I've been looking for 90s Honda Civic Type Rs and VTIs and things, and most of them are either gone have been modified to various standards of quality or are pristine and correspondingly incredibly expensive. So I think that is it. I think that they got used for the purpose for which they were designed, and as a result, they're no longer here.
Now, you mentioned you'd driven my Honda S2000, and that is one of, therefore, my fond memories of a Honda.
Me driving your S2000 is one of your fond memories?
Yes, I'm very happy you drove my Honda. It meant I didn't have to. But no, because I don't know if we should recount this story, but it was something that came up in the office, if you remember. We were kind of idly sort of saying we should just go on a road trip. A few of us in the office have got roadsters, like group editor Paul Wager had his Alpha Spider Series 4.
So which he has since replaced with the Honda S2000.
Yes, indeed. He's just sold his Series 4 Spider for a Honda S2000, the right choice. But anyway, so he had his Series 4 Alpha. Simon Goldsworthy, our editor on Classics Monthly, had an MGF at the time, which he was willing to lend to us. Another colleague had an Audi TT Roadster, and another one had a BMW Z3. So suddenly the idea of a kind of Roadster road trip was born, and I think we decided to go and see Mr. Hubnut himself, Ian Seabrook, who was not long moved to Wales at that point, so that felt like a sensible cross-country beeline to head towards. So that's what we did, and I think we set off from Peterborough early one Saturday morning and try to avoid motorways, if I remember rightly. We just sort of did cross-country the whole way. I thought it was just a fabulous road trip, but the sort of the kind of end point to that was that the next morning I'd promised I'd be up in Newcastle. So having driven from Peterborough all the way to deepest Wales on the sort of Ceredigion coast or whatever I've just probably mispronounced the name. I've offended loads of Welsh people now. I do apologise. But anyway, Aberystwyth, that kind of part of the world. We got there. I then had to get up at some ridiculous time in the morning to drive my Honda up to Newcastle. And of course, it was just a fabulous drive. It was so fun. It was a long drive. I think it took about 5 or 6 hours in the end to get to Newcastle. But of course, the car didn't miss a beat. It was actually surprisingly comfortable for quite an angry sports car. I mean, don't get me wrong, none of the other cars let themselves down, and actually what was interesting about that experiment was that the Bmw Z3, which often gets berated for its sort of non-ultimate driving machine credentials, it actually wasn't as bad as...
No, that was the one that everyone agreed was the huge surprise of that weekend, was that the BMW Z3 1.8 was actually really good fun to drive around Wales.
Yeah, it was actually quite comfortable, it was quite civilised, and, you know, it looks distinctive, so that was all right. The Alpha was the Alpha, you know, you bought it for you bought it for the badge, and all the idiosyncrasies came with it, you know, but it was still lovely. The MGF was the MGF. This one was actually quite a good example, and again probably had the best ride. And actually the Audi TT was probably the least favourite, I would argue, because it was just, I don't know, you know, it was only okay.
And the problem is that I got on the rotor of driving that weekend, or the first day, I got straight out of your S2000 into the TT, and you could not come across two more diametrically opposed visions of what a two-seater roadster should be than that, because that was an S2000 into it was a Quattro TT. It was one of the ones with 200 and something horsepower, so it made roughly the same power, but obviously it's front engine, transverse engine, four-wheel drive, designed for making fast progress over twisty roads, but not in a particularly involving or subtle way. It just sort of smashes itself down the road very, very capably. It was probably the fastest point to point, as they always say on those sort of road tests, but the S2000 beforehand obviously is the complete opposite, in that it's rear-wheel drive, quite tightly wound, even by Honda standards, which says something. Very raw, but again very smooth and refined, and it's all about the top-end power, and it's got lovely tactile controls that have been deliberately designed to have, you know, weight and feel and to be a pleasure to use, while the TT just has some steering that's very nice and a gear change that you change the gears and things. And it's just, yeah, I think that contrast really brought home what Honda were doing with the S2000 and why it works so well as a sports car. And there are very few modern classic era, I suppose it now is, sports cars that do what I would deem the sports car thing as well as the S2000.
Well, it's interesting that I now own both. I own an Audi TT, albeit in coupe form, and a Honda S2000, and I can properly see up close the differences between the two cars. Like, I remember going up to one of our events up at Donington when I lived up in Peterborough, and there's a lovely sort of cross-country drive you can do, and the sun was shining, and it was just the most beautiful day, perfect for a Honda S2000. It was roof down, quick squirt up the A1 and then across country all the way to Donington, and it was glorious. Absolutely one of the best drives I'd done that year. The Audi TT would never have entertained in that same way, but actually if it was a bit drizzly and I needed to go to the shops, you could jump in the Audi TT just as easily, whereas the Honda S2000 I'd be thinking, I'm not sure that I need to go in an S2000 for this kind of journey. So there's definitely a more kind of rounded universal appeal to the Audi TT. But
I mean, it's telling at the end of that road trip weekend, having met up in the cafe to discuss our findings at the end on the beach, and roundly condemned the TT as our least favourite. Then everyone was fighting over it for the drive back to Peterborough, and everyone was so this is always the flaw with motoring journalism, and why you should never take you should always take the conclusions of any of these group tests and road trips with a slight pinch of salt. Because
there's the car that we say we should own, and there's the one that we actually do own because life and all that kind of stuff. But I do still love the S2000's interior. I think it's one of the best interiors ever designed. I love its purity of sort of form. Again, you talk about sort of design excellence and how it's been designed with such a clarity of purpose.
I think that is the clarity of purpose. If you had to sum up Honda, I think that's one of the things they always go into all their cars and they approach everything knowing exactly what they want to do. And if they don't know what they want to do, they find out what they want to do and then they do it. In preparation for this, when I knew we were doing Honda, I reread a book that I have about Honda and the inner workings of it as a company and its ethos and how it works and how it does what it does. And it was written in the early 2000s, so it's kind of before Honda entered arguably a kind of a bit of a downer period over the past decade or so. It said that it had a quote from someone whose name I now can't remember, and it's probably in my 2,000 word set of notes that I've made in preparation for this podcast. But it was a senior executive at Honda who said that Honda's mission statement is that it sees itself as a maker of engines, and it makes good engines that last for a long time. And everything it does, whether it's making cars, motorbikes, generators, outboard motors, lawnmowers, cultivators, anything that is to make and sell engines. And you can see that Honda's, even the really boring little, like the Jazz has got a really nice, sweet little engine in it. And obviously then there's the Type Rs and stuff which all make ridiculous, and the S2000 which make ridiculous horsepower per litre from naturally aspirated engines and things like that. And just I thought that was interesting because you read that and you think, yes, they're right. That is what Honda do, isn't it? They make engines. And you sort of wonder, does every other car manufacturer have such a simple and clear mission statement as to what we are in existence to do, or is it just we're here to make money for our shareholders and we've chosen to do it by selling cars?
Well, there's a modern parallel there, isn't there? Because I mean, isn't Tesla always said it's the manufacturer of batteries?
As far as Tesla's early years were concerned, as far as I know, they saw themselves as the developer and maker of the drivetrain technology. I believe in its early years, in the era of the first Tesla Roadster, the idea was that they would then sell and license that technology to other car makers, and then they decided to have a go at making their own models instead. But yeah, I think you're right, that is an interesting parallel.
I hadn't really thought of that one before, but anyway. Well, look, I've got a few other fond memories I wanted to share, but I think before we do, we'll have a quick tea break to give people the chance to reset. So we'll take a short pause for some promotional messages, and we'll be back. So speak to you on the other side.
Speak to you soon.
If you like classic cars, then get your regular fix on classicsworld.co.uk. Updated daily, this is the go-to website for any classic car enthusiast. The site features the latest news, product stories, buyer's guides, road tests, auction reviews, project cars, videos and more. And it gets better. You can enjoy the content delivered direct to your inbox with our free weekly newsletter. Register now at www.classicsworld.co.uk and keep up to date with all that's great about classic motoring. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Right, welcome back everyone to Classics World on Your Marques, where we're talking about Honda today. I'm here with Jack Grover.
Hello.
We've been trying to define what we think makes a Honda, and design and engineering excellence and clarity of purpose, I think, were our kind of profound summaries of what makes Honda the marque it is. we were also sort of wistfully remembering the road trip we did to Wales, Jack, and I've got a few other Honda memories that I wanted to share, if I may. One of them involves a Page 3 model. And I bet you didn't expect me to say that, did you?
No.
I'm going to sort of probably condense quite possibly 2 or 3 events into one here, but I have a picture to prove that I was at an event at Silverstone. Now, I think it was with
This is very good on well-known visual medium podcasting.
Yes, exactly.
We're going to talk about you looking at pictures.
I will dig out the picture. Maybe Joe can use it as a thumbnail, but I think it was an official Honda event that was staged at Silverstone with the Honda Accord Type R. So I'm talking about possibly late 90s. I was 24 or something like that. And here I am at Silverstone driving a Honda Accord Type R. I'd love to say it was at 10 tenths, but I'm no Chris Harris, so I was probably driving it at 3 tenths round Silverstone. But they had links with a touring car team, and I think Jackie Degg was there, who's a kind of well-known Page 3 model at the time. And so she had the rather unfortunate task of posing with all these fat, overweight, incompetent motoring journalists. I mean, I was in heaven. I just thought the whole day was just. If you wanted to ask a 24-year-old what they wanted to do with their day, driving a fast car around a track and then hang out with a model to make you feel popular, that was probably the way to do it. But yeah, it was such a fantastic day.
It just goes back to what we were talking about before the break about why Honda have always struggled with their image, even though their halo cars are really good and they have the level of engineering and design that should put them up there with the bigger, well, not the big leagues, because obviously Honda's plenty big enough, but the more premium marques. And I think it's because Mercedes or BMW or Audi would never stage a press event with Page 3 models. I think that's kind of a little bit of insight, at least in the UK, where Honda's images, and they've always got that slightly boy racery Gran Turismo on PlayStation kind of image, which, as they always holds back what the image of what should be very good cars. And yet, actually, I'm now doing that thing where I talk myself out of the point I've just made, because of course Honda have that image in America. Honda's is a youth brand in America, but of course here in the UK the problem that Honda always had was that their average age was sort of 50 plus or even 60 plus at times. And then I remember that when they introduced the 8th generation Civic, the sort of spaceship one, after a few years I remember they did a press release that said Honda's average age of the Honda plummets, and it's now 51 or something like that. So they've got this weird conflicted image where they're both driven by pensioners and hooligans who hang out with Page 3 models on racetracks. And I suppose that's almost the fact they don't have an image because people just buy the Honda that suits them. And that's very strange in a car company, particularly in the modern era. Yeah,
that's quite a broad remit, isn't it? As you say, sort of 24-year-old petrol heads and 55-year-old sort of accountants. But when I was 15, I did work experience at Auto Express magazine, and I was so excited. It was way more exciting than the work experience I'd done the week before at Andrex toilet paper. I thought it was fantastic. It was the sort of thing that sort of fueled my ambitions, I guess, to be involved in motoring journalism in one capacity or another.
Oh, I thought you were talking about Andrex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, but so the Auto Express gig was fantastic because it was up in London, so kind of, I felt really grown up suddenly going up to London on the train to go to what was their office in Blackfriars at the time. And then on the Thursday, they said, do you want to go to Chobham, the Longcross Proving Ground, to do a photo shoot and road test with our road test team? And the comparison test was with the Rover 800 Coupe and the Honda Legend Coupe that were at the time, I don't believe, based on the same platform at that point. I think the Honda Legend had diverged at that point and was doing its own thing. So they had the Honda Legend Coupe and the Rover 800 Coupe, and I was picked up by the then road test editor in the Rover 800 Coupe, and then we drove out to Longcross to do the test where the Honda Legend Coupe was waiting for us. And I mean, this was just kid in a candy store stuff. I was there, at this test track, driving these cars. And at the lunch break or something like that, the art editor jumped in the Honda Legend Coupe and said, well, I'm going to have a quick spin. Do you want to come along? So I jumped in the passenger seat and he's driving around, and he was driving quite aggressively and saying, do you know what? This is so much better than the Rover. It just handles so much better. And as he said that, he came over the crest of a hill where there was some sort of army transporter coming the other way, which caused him to flinch and hit the brakes mid-apex, which then had him pirouetting this Honda Legend into, I don't know what it was, some sort of raised brick drainage house or something like that, and basically bent this Honda Legend round this drainage house, and it kind of turned into like a boomerang shape. And I remember it popped the rear glass. It actually contacted the brick house with the fuel tank side of the car. I was wearing glasses, which had pinged off and landed in the back seat. And this car just came to a halt. And the guy sort of said a rather choice Viking word. And I just remember going, oh my God, where are my glasses? I was only worried. I was clearly in a bit of shock. Got out of the car. We were both absolutely fine. And this art guy was clearly just monumentally embarrassed that his driving prowess had come to a rather abrupt end. Testimony to the car, it was absolutely, although it had taken quite an impact, we as occupants were absolutely fine. And, it was a rather sad end to this sort of twin test. But it was a fabulous car. Before that crash, it was a really excellent car. It wasn't perhaps it didn't feel as luxurious as the Rover 800. The Rover 800 had these lovely piped leather seats and all this sort of thing. But had it not been bent round a little brick kind of drainage house, that Honda Legend would probably still be around today. Whereas I imagine the Rover 800 would have rotted away and now be sort of stacked up in a junkyard somewhere.
So that's like the ultimate version of sort of those annoying eBay adverts when they say ran when parked 6 years ago. Before the accident, the Honda was lovely.
But I have to say, it credit to the team at Auto Express, it didn't put me off going into motoring journalism.
I mean, yeah, you can't accuse them of only showing you the good bits or not showing you the full scope of what the job can entail.
And I don't think it was even a press car. I think the Honda Legend Coupe belonged to the managing director of Honda UK at the time, so I think the embarrassment was even greater. But of course, Honda were superbly magnanimous and understanding about it, and were purely concerned for our welfare, which again every good press office is trained to do. But I thought it was a really good. I still have sort of fond memories of it, and I have also photographic evidence of that as well, which I'll say for the self-published autobiography in years to come, which I'll just sell in single-digit copies to my family. But rightly or wrongly, I think one of the reasons that Honda is, I think, highly regarded in certain quarters in the UK is because of its association with the British car industry. First of all, with its association with Triumph and the Acclaim, and obviously for a longer period with the Rover Group. And I don't know, I'd be interested to know, Jack, your take on Honda's collaboration with Rover, because I think it was game changing, and that's a well trotted out phrase, but I think it's a phrase that really epitomises where Honda's influence in the British car industry, it just made us up our game. It dragged us out of the British Leyland quagmire that we found ourselves in come the late 70s. And they don't get the credit they deserve for what they achieved, both with their own cars, but also the British branded stuff. So yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's broadly right. I think you're absolutely right that obviously Honda was instrumental in pulling BL, Rover, whatever it was, whichever side of the name change we're talking about specifically, out of its malaise, which obviously in the late 70s seemed terminal. Endless relaunches of the Princess and then the SD1 and things like that, and the Metro just about gets over the line as a good car, but still very clearly based on the sort of engineering blueprint of the Mini, and then you get the Ital and the Ambassador, and then suddenly bam, the Triumph Acclaim drops. And even though it's very very obviously a Honda Ballard with the badges changed, it's it proves that British Leyland and British factories can make a good car. If you somehow managed to put a claim in front of someone who had no idea of Honda but knew Triumph, I think they would find a sort of common ground there, even though you can sense the Honda-ness if you know it. But I think the Acclaim was a fitting end to the Triumph badge, and then
the Triumph Acclaim is fascinating because we've driven one for the Classics World YouTube channel. It belongs to the editor of Classics Monthly, Simon Goldsworthy, who's now got 2, I believe, on the collection. And I just think it's one of those, like you say, it's a car. It's a case of probably the right car at the wrong time, because obviously it was the last car Triumph ever made, and yet it was probably, a really good example of how a collaboration between two companies can really work to a positive end, because it was such a wonderfully competent car, arguably better than the Montego that was sort of being developed at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hesitate to call the Acclaim a collaboration, because it really wasn't. It is just a rebadged Honda Ballade. I know it's got sort of, British-made seats, and I know that it had enough local content in it to count as a British car, which was obviously crucial for all sorts of reasons, particularly back then. But I think collaboration's wrong. It's very much Honda putting it in front of the chapped at Cowley and saying, this is what a good car is like, this is how you design it, this is how you make it, and we're going to show you how. I think if you want to get into the realms of collaboration, you need to go a couple of generations onto that and go for the R8 Rover 200 400, which was a genuine collaboration from blank blueprint between Honda and Rover, and
is that the absolute peak of that tie-in? Because I mean, a Rover R8 is probably one of my favourite Rovers, actually. And again, we had a Rover 216 SLI on fleet for a while, and I just thought it was blisteringly good for the 400 quid that it cost us. It was the Honda engined one rather than the K series one, because I didn't have shares in head gaskets, so it felt like the more sensible option. But yeah, that was a collaboration from the get-go, was it? The Rover and Honda worked together on it.
I mean, this is, again, I can say this because our producer is not able to butt in, but I know, because I know he loves the R8. I like it, and I will say, without reservation, I think it's probably the best car that the British motor industry, certainly the whole span of BMC to MG Rover to bust, I think of all of that span, I think the R8 is probably the best car they ever made in an objective sense. I don't like it as a Rover, and I will always have the Honda Concerto, which is the Honda version, over a Rover version, because I think Rover should be a certain sort of car, and the R8 isn't one. It's a brilliant car, but it's not a Rover. And I think, why have a dull Rover when you can have the Concerto, which is a really good Honda? But in terms of the nuts and bolts, my understanding is that the sort of the basic floor pan is a Civic, but the body, and because it's a sort of stretched Civic floor pan, I believe, and that stretching and this body and the structure on top was all engineered by Rover, as was the suspension tuning, and the interior was done by Rover. And then Honda obviously supplied the engines, and they did a lot of the design for production, the productionization, and obviously a lot of work on how to build it properly. Rover and the Japanese market Concerto had different suspension because Honda had different standards, but the European Concerto and the Rover have the same suspension, which is the Rover version. So it was a real give and take, and they both play to each other's strengths there, because Honda did the sort of the basic engineering and the productionization and the quality control, and then Rover did the suspension tuning and the interior and the looks of the thing, and you get really is the best of both worlds there, and I think that the result was a cracking little car.
I mean, I don't want to undermine what BMW did with things like the Rover 75, but my rather strong, completely pointless speculation is that if British Leyland, Honda and Rover had continued in the same vein, Rover would still be around today. Discuss.
I think it would. I think it would be in some form. I would not be surprised if all they were rebadged and retrimmed Hondas. I think you'd be looking at that. I don't think there'd be any independent engineering by now, but a Honda is not a bad car to base anything on, and I think if Honda had increased its stake in Rover to full ownership at the time of the where in reality BMW came in, and therefore they completely absorbed all the design and engineering, made use of Rover's strengths in engineering, which is still, Rover was still really, really good at suspension tuning and steering and handling and noise, vibration and harshness and all that. There's areas where, arguably, particularly in the 90s, Honda was still lagging a bit. Absorbed all that knowledge and skill into their own engineering, and then fed that. So when they were developing the next gen Civics and Accords and Legends and things, they were designed with Rovers in mind from the start, because they were now equal partners, not just collaborators. And I think you'd see a line of Rover badged cars for Europe, which were kind of like Honda's Acura, but for Europe. You'd see Rover as a kind of upmarket Honda for Europe, and maybe even America by then, who knows.
Well, put it this way, I'd have rather have had a Honda Jazz derived Rover Metro than a Tata IndyCar based City Rover. You know, if you wanted to see a sort of a badge engineering gone wrong, I wouldn't have cared if Rovers were effectively just Hondas with Rover badges on them with a bit of Roverization inside. I think that would have still been a market success. I think you've got to look at the badge engineering that still exists to this day and things like the VW group to see that a Rover badge engineered Honda would have been perfectly successful, I think.
The thing is, of course, you then have to come back to reality with the bump and realise that even by the time the R8 came out, Honda had already opened its plant in Swindon, and they'd got pretty much what they wanted out of the Rover collaboration, which was the insight and knowledge into how to build and design cars for Europe. They were building them in Europe very successfully, and they were looking towards, I think, making 300,000 cars a year for Europe, certainly selling 300,000 cars a year in Europe. And they obviously didn't really need Rover, certainly not as anything like as much as Rover needed Honda. I think that was always the cold truth, was that Honda were in it for very specific reasons at their end, and they were happy to go along with it. And then once they got what they needed, they got out when they saw the option.
I mean, the collaboration didn't always work positively. I'm thinking of the Honda Crossroad. What was the discovery?
Oh, the Honda badge discovery for Japan. Yeah, I always wondered what anyone in Japan who bought up one of those thinks, because you go in thinking, oh, Honda, Honda, as we've said all the way through this podcast, engineering integrity and build quality, and you get an early solid hull built Mark 1 Discovery with a sonar blue interior. It must have been such a culture shock. And I mean, even if they were built properly, a Discovery is not a car with anything like the engineering integrity of a Honda.
I've owned a Series 1 Discovery, and
I love Series 1 Discoveries. They're great cars, but they're not a Honda.
the Fisher Price plastics inside are certainly not of Honda grade, yes, I can imagine the Japanese audience being woefully underwhelmed by that particular experience and sort of thinking, well, hang about, we're giving them this fantastic Honda Accord based saloon car or whatever, and we get this bag of bolts. I mean, it's just not great.
It's interesting. This is kind of like the mirror image of the stuff we were talking about earlier, that the Japanese did quite like the Discovery when it was sold to them as a Land Rover, because it was a Land Rover. It obviously wasn't setting the expectation of it being a Honda, and it came with the whole British Daktari Safari image, which the Honda Crossroad didn't have. So they were quite happy to take the product as a Land Rover, but not as a Honda. Yeah, it's so strange.
Very, very much so. And of course, like you say, Honda did get what they wanted out of it, because they managed to sort of get a footprint into the UK and Europe as a whole. But it's all come to a bit of a sad end now, and I think the sort of the closure of the Swindon Honda factory is a kind of rather regrettable sort of end to that era of Honda's relationship with Europe and specifically the British car market, I believe Honda's market share in Europe is still relatively tiny. Like, arguably the experiment hasn't worked anyway, so it feels a shame. It's not based, their lack of market share is not because of competence in their cars, and I think that's the tragedy.
I've got the figures here in my essay of notes. So last year, Honda made up 0.8% of European registrations, which is down from their high point of 2% in 2007. Wow,
that's incredible, isn't it? I mean, and such a shame, because it's, it can't be because the cars are bad. They are. I think superb. But I'm going to suggest we take a quick break, and then we're going to do another little bit of time to wrap up. Because there's still a few more things I wanted to cover, so we'll take a brief pause, and we'll be back on the other side.
If you like tuned and modified cars, then get your regular fix on fastcar.co.uk. The website represents all that's great about the performance and modified car scene, featuring some of the very best feature cars from around the world, plus the latest news and product reviews, tech tips, project cars, motorsport news, videos and more. You can enjoy the very best content from the site delivered direct to your inbox with our free weekly newsletter. Register now at www.fastcar.co.uk and keep up to date with all that's great about modern and modified car culture. You're listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover.
Well, welcome back everyone to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast. This one's about Honda. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, including meandering probably a bit too much into the Rover collaboration, which may or may not make the final edit, but we'll see. Now, one of the real dichotomies I find with Honda, Jack, is how a company that made the sort of iconic cars like the S2000 and the NSX can then be responsible for the Honda logo.
You don't mean the H in a box on the bonnet, do you? You mean the tiny little K car?
It's not even a K car, is it? It's just a city car, wasn't it? It was sort of it sort of sat rather uncomfortably sort of below the Civic and predates the Jazz. Toyota did something similar with the Starlet and then went on to create the Yaris. The Honda logo just seemed to be a really sort of lame attempt at coming into the city market, which by then was already rife with really competent European cars.
I have just checked. You're right. The logo isn't a K car. I was thinking of the Life. It's just a Super Mini. And I will admit now, this is a car that I do not know a huge amount. I believe they did make it over to the UK briefly, didn't they? And obviously not greatly successfully. You might have hit the nail on the head when you said that it lacked the clarity of vision. And I think Honda Vision and Clarity are both Honda model names that I keep trying to make accidental puns on. And I think this is what happens when someone at Honda obviously said, we need the Civic's getting a little bit big, and Nissan and Toyota have both got Super Minis, so we need a Super Mini, and they made it because they felt they had to, not because they wanted to, would be my guess. About.
I love the idea. I think it was on a Sniff and Smith podcast or video that I saw where they Richard Porter, I think, speculated on the idea that Honda basically dissolved their design department and then just sort of delegated the design responsibilities around the whole company. So, you know, one of the former designers sort of got to work with the sort of Honda S2000 or whatever, but Sandra on the reception desk of Honda Canada got the job of designing the next generation Jazz and just doodled it in her lunch break. Which is perhaps a bit unfair, but it would certainly explain the disparity between, I think, something of such purity of form and purpose like an S2000 or an NSX, and something that by the time you get to, I don't know, the current generation Jazz or something, I'm sort of thinking it looks like it's just been kind of produced by some sort of collaboration of robots that had some algorithms put together that said, design a car that can seat 4 people and luggage, go. And there was no actual thought to whether it looked nice or anything. I mean, perhaps going back to your thing that they're, you know, producers of engines that they wrap a metal box around. Well, the Jazz is probably that and that alone, isn't it?
Probably because it's a very good box around the Jazz, as we've talked about before. I have just googled it because obviously there's nothing more exciting for a podcast listener to listen to than two people googling next to a microphone. The logo is related, or the EV Plus, as it's technically called, was based on the logo, and I think that's interesting because I was going to bring up the EV without even realising that logo connection. That Honda were really early on the battery electric vehicle train with the EV, because I think it was one of the first mass production EVs, and then obviously they went on to hybrid and fuel cell stuff, and yet. Where are Honda with the EV craze now?
Yeah, have they been left behind? I mean, certainly in the UK, they've been a bit late. You know, the Honda CR-V never offered a hybrid until the current generation. The Honda E's only just come out and appears to be this fabulous design exercise, but not as competitive as an equivalent Kia Niro or even the Mini.
Yeah, I read a little bit of analysis on this, partly just to check that my impression that Honda went through a bit of a rough spell in the 2010s, and particularly with the EV and alternative powertrain. I was thinking, are Honda really doing anything with that? Again, going back to their thing of making engines, which obviously is a bit of a problem if you can't make engines anymore. And it seems that I was right. I read some analysis on this, that, yeah, they did. And post-financial crash in 2007 and 8, Honda basically went into a little bit, not a decline, but they sort of struggled, and there was a bit of a corporate culture shift where basically all the stuff that made Honda so distinctive as a company previously got kind of diluted down a bit, and they started explicitly wanting to chase Toyota as and having a globe-spanning model range from all the segments and in the matching Toyota's sales volumes, and they began specifically chasing that and not. They lost that Honda clarity, which is again the word that we keep coming back to, which is also a fuel cell car. They also started making various sorts of budget cuts internally, and one of the things that got canned was the EV and hybrid program, and the budget was cut, and what was left was diverted into the fuel cell program, which obviously so far has not yet borne fruit, although who knows if it might do, because they seem to be making up ground in both in terms of EVs and more in general their design, because that Honda E, which seems to have gone down very well, I've no idea if I've seen a couple around actually, so it's obviously selling to someone, but I think that's got some of the Honda magic about it. I mean, the fact that it looks like an N600 helps.
Isn't the worry with the Honda E is that it's fallen into that trap that a lot of manufacturers do, where they've tried to sort of go back to some retro inspired styling. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still got some little Honda flashes of brilliance, those kind of camera door mirrors with screens inside and stuff. But I don't know, I'm not sure it's got the competitive edge still. I mean, it's certainly distinctive, but in terms of driving range and things like that, I don't think it's as competitive as some of the other EVs on the market at the moment. So I don't know. I think it's probably going to prove to be a bit of a Marmite car that people either love or hate, really. Again,
it'll be interesting for Honda, because they generally don't make those sort of cars. I suppose they do around the fringes. The S2000s are always a bit of a Marmite car, and some people just don't get on with. Some people don't get on with the traditional way that you've got to thrash the nut, or seemingly thrash the nuts off every Honda engine to get anything out of it. But yeah.
Have they ever made any other bad cars? Have they ever had any other flops?
The one that, I mean, this is going back a long way into the sort of dark ages of Honda's almost prehistory. As the one that springs to mind is the Honda 1300 from the 1960s, which is the one that failed so much that it made them do the Civic, and it's kind of that where triumph comes through adversity, not triumph the acclaim, but triumph, which I think I can pick up one of the Shishiro Honda quotes that I jotted down. Success can only be achieved through repeated failure and introspection. Success represents 1% of your work, which results only from the 99% that is called failure. And the Honda 1300 was that failure, because that was sort of meant to be Honda's first kind of proper car after they'd done the S8, the S800 and the mini cars and the tiny little pickup trucks with motorbike engines. The Honda 1300 was again meant to be their proper car, 1300 four-cylinder engine, except it was air cooled, and it had some bizarre, which the sort of engineering fan in me absolutely loves. I can't remember what they called it. They called it something that wasn't the twin charge, or it was something, the twin Dynaflow, and it had some brilliant 60s brand name on it, but it was basically had two cooling fans and two air-cooled cooling systems where the air went around the inside of the engine like the water does in a water-cooled engine, and then another airstream went around the outside to cool the air that was inside it, and it was all made out of aluminium alloy, and it was ridiculously expensive to make, and yet it revved to 9,000 RPM, produced 120 horsepower from 1300cc, as is always the Honda way, and it completely flopped. And that's when they took stock and said, well, we need to do something more conventional. Let's make the Civic, and then that worked and set them up for the company that they became as a car maker. But I think that's Honda failing through being too ambitious and sort of sticking slightly too closely to what they see at the time as their ethos, because that was all motorbike derived, and that was what struck me when I drove. But the first time I drove a Mark 1 Civic, it was a Mark 1 Civic Honda-matic with the automatic gearbox that isn't an automatic gearbox but sort of is. Driving that round town, I thought, this drives like a twist and go scooter, and it feels like a four-wheeled motorbike. It's all very light and precise, and you can tell that's where it comes from. But no, the 1300 was what immediately thought of when you thought of duffers for Honda.
I'm going sort of bang up to date, really, because I'm not really won over by many of the contemporary output from Honda. Like I think where the current Civic is just a bit weird. Like it just looks like a lot of bulges and bumps and for no real packaging advantages that I can see. Even the one with the funny triangular exhaust pipes and things, because I don't know the generation ones, but where it's actually quite a small car inside and the boot space is terrible and the interior packaging is pretty terrible. But it had this sort of lovely kind of quirky styling, which I think kind of worked. Whereas this one seems to be all kind of bumps and bulges, and it doesn't really do anything for it at all. They need another NSX or S2000, I think. One last petrol-powered hurrah before they all get outlawed in 2030 or whatever.
That would be nice. Yes, I think Honda would struggle. I think to do what we would consider a proper Honda engine in with modern emissions regulations, because even the Civic Type R's now are turbocharged, and they're losing some of that Honda VTEC zing. It's interesting that we're recording this the week after the 2022 Civic was unveiled in prototype form, and it looks a lot more bland, but in a good way, than the current Civic, which I agree with you is a bit of a disjointed mess. And the new one just looks like a small Accord. It bodes well, because you're right that there's a difference. Honda's styling is rarely, although sometimes they hit it out of the park, has rarely been their strong point, but equally it's rarely their weakness. A lot of them are very, very dull and generic, but equally you think that's a dull but pleasant, and it's a design that works. And the current Civic just is a mess. It looks like it was designed by about 6 different people, all working on separate drawing boards and sticking it together. And the new one, the one that was released or unveiled last week, looks much more conventional and toned down. And it was interesting that they launched it on Twitch, which is the video game streaming site, because they consider it a youth car, because obviously in America, I think the average age of the Civic driver is 24 or something, 25. It's very young. And it's still got a manual gearbox. It's still going to have a manual gearbox, because they consider that a trait that their market likes, and they consider that part of Honda's brand values in America, that it's an enthusiast car, and the enthusiasts like having a manual gearbox. And
so they've launched this new Civic on the Twitch platform.
Yeah. What
are they going to do with the actual UK buyers that buy it? Are they going to write them letters?
It's interesting. I think this is the thing. We're sitting here in the UK, and I think although we can chart the reasons why they decline, I just don't think Honda particularly care about us anymore, because they never, on a global scale, they never really did, because they were just making their millions in America, where the Civic and the Accord just topped the bestseller charts year after year, either overall or certainly as in their segments. I don't know what your average 50-year-old Honda buyer is going to do here when they go on Twitch to watch people playing Fortnite and then look at the new Honda.
So here's an idle thought for you. Would Honda ever merge or collaborate with another company?
I don't think they would. I think of course, Honda have always very greatly valued their independence, which is apparently one of the other reasons they got into a bit of trouble post financial crash, was that they deliberately refused to take any bailouts or sort of development grants from the Japanese government when it was on offer, because they didn't want to be have any of the strings attached. So they did all their cost cutting and reformation internally off their own bat. But equally, of course, they tied up with Rover, BL, to get, because Rover had something that they wanted and had identified a need for, which was a toehold in Europe, which was then obviously tariffed to them, which it isn't now, and they needed Rover's knowledge about European design and tuning and market demands. And so I can see that if Honda decided that they were really falling short on EV and other alternative powertrains, and another company was in a state which they had the knowledge but didn't have were going through a shaky business time, or had very obviously weaknesses that Honda had strengths in, as if BL did with its productioning and build quality, I can see they might consider it.
Because here's the thing, I'm sort of this is ridiculous in many ways, and I can't see it ever happening, but I would see Honda as being a really good parent for Jaguar and Land Rover. But I just don't think it would ever happen.
Explain yourself, Phil. I don't even see that. I can't quite follow your logic on that one.
Well, only that there's been sort of various speculation that Tata might try and offload certainly Jaguar, if not Land Rover.
I can see that. I can't see what Honda's interest would be in it.
Well, I mean, it would give Honda a stake in a prestige marque. They would be able to imbue Jaguar with the engineering base that it needs. But like you say, the rationale's just not there anymore. And if they learnt anything from their past British collaborations, they might think better of it.
Do you just want another Honda Crossroad? Is that all you? Is that a secret what you want for? You're envisaging the 2035 Honda Crossroad Land Rover Discovery.
I guess I'm in danger of again turning it into a non-Honda podcast, but I suppose really when I think about my fondness for the Jaguar brand and how I wish it could be imbued with some of that Honda engineering and reliability sort of excellence, it's unlikely, isn't it? So will Honda survive full stop then? Does it just become a kind of an engineering consultancy in 20 years' time where it's just providing powertrains of some form or another, whether it's hydrogen or electric?
I don't think so. I think Honda will survive in some form. I think it's undergone so much change in its relatively short history as far as car companies goes that I think in terms of cars it may only exist as a sort of technology and drivetrain supplier, but I mean I don't think it's in danger of its bikes going anywhere. And if a company can go from making World Grand Prix winning superbikes to making lawnmowers and making portable generators and outboard motors and hydrogen fuel cells and robots that can walk upstairs and city cars and supercars, I think they'll find something else to they'll find a way of transitioning into something else.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it? Because actually here we are perhaps looking at it very much through the UK prism of Honda in Britain, and yet Honda is so much more globally, both as a car manufacturer, as a bike manufacturer, as an outboards motors manufacturer, lawnmowers and everything else. Honda as a engineering concern worldwide is way bigger than we need to worry about in dear old Blighty, don't we? So I guess that's the point. Let's do a little bit of a buying segment then, Jack. Have we got some price points?
I went for sub 5k as my lowest one.
Go on then.
And actually some of these I think all of these in fact were nowhere near close. Unlike last episode when we talked about Jaguar, where I was talking hypothetically, on this one I actually went on to eBay and Car and Classic and actually found specific cars that are around for sale at the time of recording. But for sub 5k, if I had 5k to spend on a Honda, it wouldn't be a car, it would be a bike, it would be a Honda 50 Super Cub, just because I think that is one of the not only an iconic Honda product. What is the total Super Cub production total sitting at the moment? 60 million Honda Super Cubs of various sorts, and I think I would have one of those in my collection, and that you can buy those for next to nothing. So anyway, I get that on the record. Then for sub 5k for Honda cars, there were two that piqued my interest at the time I was looking. One was an Insight Mark 1, but with a dead battery. Although the advert did say, new battery pack with car, fitting is very easy. And I thought, is it really? And then the other one, just because it would be interesting, and this one was up for sale for $2,000, there was a 1989 Honda Legend 2.7 V6. And I would have that just to see if it's any better than the Rover 800 that I despise so much.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I think sub $5,000 for me. I think I don't know. I struggle to find anything majorly exciting. I think I'd probably end up going for something like a nicely spec'd Honda Accord as a sensible daily driver. I've just looked very quickly online and found a 1990 Honda Prelude for £5,000 with 46,000 miles, something like that. I don't know if that's a four-wheel steer model, but it's that certainly comes into as a sub $5,000 purchase. A Honda Prelude of there's a slightly more modern one, late 90s one for £1,800 here, for example. Those kind of things look pretty reasonable to me.
Prelude would be very interesting. If it was a four-wheel steer one, that'd be very interesting.
So if you went north of 5?
I found two specific cars for sale. One of which, if I had the money in my hand, I would be on the phone to this chap immediately to buy it. For $7,995, a Civic EK4, which is the 5th generation one, 1.6 VTI 3-door in a nice bluey purple colour. I haven't got the mileage jotted down here, but it was very low mileage, unmodified, unmolested condition. I think that would be both a fantastically fun car to own, and that would only go up in value. I don't think that would be a great classic to sit on and just keep.
I've already got my $5,000 to $10,000 Honda, of course. I've got my S2000.
The other one that I found for £5,500 was a Mark 1 Civic 4-door Honda-matic in metallic turquoise with a vinyl fabric roof.
Wow, now you're talking.
Going back to the 1970s, yeah.
So what should our next price point be?
The next one I had was 10 to 30. On that one I got, you'll be pleased with this, S2000, Couldn't really be anything else in that price range. I found one with 24,000 miles on with a hard top for £17,500. That's a 2005 model. Towards the upper end of the price range for one of those, but it was a good one, and it's theoretical money, so why wouldn't you? And then for $12,995, I found a 1992 CRX VTEC in Celestial Blue, which just looked the business and would go like the business too for that, I think.
Yeah, it's quite tricky, that price point, isn't it, for Hondas? Certainly the UK ones. I mean, I've just seen an Integra Type R, which would be quite a good garage buddy to my S2000. Similarly bonkers car. How far north do I have to go to justify an NSX?
I put an early 90s 5-speed manual NSX in my money no object bracket, just because, although I've never driven one, there should be a chance to, I'm sure I'd like it. And then I also put in there the original Civic Type R, the EK9, in bright yellow, because all cars are better in bright yellow, particularly fast ones. I think you'd probably end up having to import one from Japan, because I think all the ones that are over here have probably been modified to death, literally. Find a nice standard one of those, and that again would just be a absolute scream of a car to own.
Interesting, when I did have a quick scout on one of the well-known car classified websites, there were 9,709 Hondas for sale, 18,900 Toyotas, twice as many Toyotas as there were Hondas. There were even more Nissans, and it's actually only Mitsubishi and Suzuki that had fewer cars online for sale than Honda, which again goes back to our point, the fact that they've never really achieved the scale, despite, certainly in Europe, their competence deserves, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how Honda completely smashed the American market and yet never had the same scale breakthrough in Europe. I don't know if that's just because their products really filled a niche that opened up in America in the 70s when everyone was crying out for well-engineered, economical, small cars that were nice to drive, and the big three had nothing to touch that. And we didn't have quite the same gap. Almost from the moment that the first Civic touched wheels in California, it's absolutely smashed it in the sales charts, and they still do.
Do you think there's an off chance that there's going to be people in America listening to this podcast at some point in the future going, what are these two talking about? Like, they don't know what they're chatting about. Anyway, well, look, we should probably wrap it up, I guess. I feel like we've waxed lyrical about Honda sufficiently to celebrate its greatness. Like you, I feel a fondness for Honda that it doesn't seem to be reflected in the cars that it necessarily is famous for in the UK or well known for in the UK. I don't know. I wish it had achieved even greater levels of fame and popularity in the UK than it has, because I think they've produced so many fantastic cars over the years and achieved so much greatness in everything it does that it's not reflected in the numbers, which is a real pity.
I quite agree. I couldn't sum it up better myself.
Well, look, we should venture to do other things for our day. But thank you very much, Jack Grover, for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Your insight was superb. You stood up to your civic responsibilities, and you've proven to be an absolute legend. So
and we were at accord with each other. Yes, we could do this all day.
Excellent. Well, we got all of them in. I think that was very good and all that jazz. But anyway, Jack, thanks again very much for your time. This has been the Classics World on Your Marques podcast. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Classics World on Your Marques podcast with Phil Weeden and Jack Grover. For more, visit classicsworld.co.uk or youtube.com/classicsworlduk.